The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison. Thank you for joining us today. I'm the president at 1615 Church Missions Coaching, and I also serve as a church missions coach. Now, before we get into the topic at hand, I'd like to let you know about a few upcoming webinars at 1615, focusing on finances and their relation to the global missionary cause. On March 28, 2018, at 12 noon Mountain Time, the first session will be Stewardship of God's Assets, Rethinking What It Means to Be Generous. It will be led by Virgil Dugan of the National Christian Foundation. And in this webinar, we're going to explore that our modern cultural definition of generosity may actually prevent us from being truly generous. We hope you'll join us for this webinar as we explore the biblical definition of generosity as it was intended by the Master. Again, you can register online at 1615.org/events, or you can link off of the homepage. The second webinar in this series has to do with business has the power to do more than charity alone. It's the second part in this series on finances. It will be led by Amy Minich and Jeff Johns of the Impact Foundation. In this webinar, we'll discuss how businesses can make more kingdom impact than simply giving to charities. Forbes has named Kingdom Impact Investing the #1 trend in philanthropy for the last 2 years. We hope you join us in this important webinar as the Impact Foundation explains how donors who desire to change the world through business can also earn a return on their charitable capital. Please register at 1615.org/events. Today's webinar is entitled Mobilizing the Emerging Generation of Missionaries. What would it take for you to unapologetically, unreservedly decide to move your life to Saudi Arabia to share the gospel? This next generation of missionaries may be uniquely positioned to complete the Great Commission, but the ever-shifting roadmap of missions makes that task difficult today. In today's webinar, we're going to consider what a roadmap to the mission field might look like and how a church can mentor millennials into greater impact in places where the story of Jesus is largely untold. Today's subject matter expert is Stephen. We're not going to give his last name for security reasons. We've also withheld his photograph there. He currently serves as the Director of Mobilization with Cafe 1040. The mission of Cafe 1040 is to lead a generation to tell the story of Jesus where it has never been told. In just a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Stephen, but first, a couple of details. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. We have lots of people online today, and we need to make sure that everyone can hear. You can listen through your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind, and I want to emphasize this, they will come to mind. Please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We're going to be addressing your questions for the last 15 or 20 minutes of our time together. And really, this is your opportunity to join the conversation with Stephen and address him directly about your questions. Nearly 100 people are registered for today's live webinar. I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded. We record all of our webinars, and it will be available for viewing at 1615.org within the week. So again, you can rewatch this or share it with those in your sphere of influence at 1615.org within the week. I'm now going to hand it over to Stephen, which will take me just a second here. Stephen, I want to thank you so much for taking your time today to share with us. The webinar is all yours.
All right. Matthew, thank you. Thanks so much for having me on today. So grateful for this opportunity and all you guys do over at 1615 for the sake of the kingdom. So pleasure to be here today. As Matthew mentioned, my name is Stephen. I serve as the Director of Mobilization for Cafe 1040. Been there for about 5 years now in this role. Spent 10 years prior to that in college ministry at the University of Georgia. And so this topic today is near and dear to my heart, as I personally have a big passion to see this next generation mobilized specifically to take the gospel to the places where it's not. And so as Matthew said, for Cafe 1040, if you're unfamiliar with us, like you said, our mission is to lead a generation to tell the story of Jesus where it's never been told. Our whole focus is helping young adults gain clarity around their calling, reach the field, and ultimately make disciples and plant churches in the places where the gospel is not. And so main thing we do is we have a 3-month mentorship takes place overseas. For all of those reasons, I couldn't be more excited about our webinar today. Our community at Cafe 1040, we care deeply about this topic. This is the very reason we exist. We are passionate to see the gospel reach the places where it's not. And we believe this next generation, the young adults of today, we believe that they are the future of missions. These are the ones who ultimately will be used by God to continue his mission and see the gospel reaching the ends of the earth. And so like many of you, as we look out across the vast landscape of missions, we recognize this is a strategic opportunity right before us to work with these young adults, to invest in them and help them ultimately get to the places where God might use them for the glory of his name. Now, certainly obstacles before us. If you've read any recent studies on millennials or Generation Z, lots of thoughts, lots of opinions out there. Certainly, they have their baggage like every other generation does. They've got some downsides, some things that could create challenges. At the same time, we at Cafe 1040 are of the belief that they also are uniquely positioned, uniquely gifted, uniquely talented by God to play a significant role in this. I'm one who believes there is so much potential for this generation to be used by God to see his gospel reach the ends of the earth. And when you think about some key characteristics of this next generation, let me just pause there for 1 second. One of the things that we see a lot, and I imagine that you're seeing this in your churches a good bit, is that there is a lot of passion amongst these young adults, right? Lots of passion and zeal and desire to get involved, to give their lives to things that matter. But at the heart of one of the problems we're experiencing right now is that passion and interest doesn't seem to be translating into steps and commitment. It doesn't seem to be translating into steps towards a long-term commitment. If you're like us, you've seen lots of passion, lots of interest. You probably had a lot of people signing up for your short-term trips. You have people signing up for 1 month and 3 months and beyond, but not a whole lot of long-term commitment. And if you're listening to this webinar, I imagine you'd agree with us that central to seeing the gospel established in the places where it's not will be a strategic focus on long-term investment. People who will move their lives overseas to these places where the gospel is not, with a long-term commitment to learn the language, to learn the culture, and stay there until a church has been started and established. And so that's a big part of what we want to talk about today, is how we can take the passion and the interest of these young adults and help translate that into steps towards long-term commitment. The reality is, when you look at the strengths of this group, they are very uniquely designed for this very work. And we say this a lot here at Cafe 1040. We use this phrase: the perceived weaknesses of today's young adults are actually latent strengths that can be utilized for the completion of the Great Commission. The very things that the world might be saying, these are weaknesses, these are concerns, these are struggles of today's young adults. We would argue that some of those things are what God has actually put within this generation to play a strategic role in the Great Commission. And so if you take just a look at some of these things, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but these are all things, if you were to do any studies or explore the next generation, and both millennials as well as some of the studies that are now coming out on Gen Z, here are just a few of the things that are used to describe them. They're passionate, they're hungry, They're willing to take risks, and not just not settle for the status quo. They want their lives to matter for things that are important. They're more globally minded than many of the generations before them. A lot of these people, the thought of driving over to Texas or flying out to California isn't that different than flying out to Japan. And if they got to Japan, they would talk to their friends and be on technology. They're more connected than they've ever been. And this last one, I believe, is really central to how they can be used for the Great Commission: technological proficiency. And there's more and more technology being used in missions today. And this generation is farther along than most of us in how they are using technology. So there is a lot of opportunity before us, so much opportunity, so much potential. But here's one of the main messages I wanna say today is that they need our help. They need our help. And in the midst of all of this passion and potential and opportunity before us, young adults today need our help to help them move past some of the short-term mindset that's so common amongst the young adults today and help them move into some long-term commitments. This is the problem that we are trying to solve, and are asking the question, how do we mobilize the emerging generation of missionaries? How do we mobilize young adults to serve long-term amongst the unreached? And probing even deeper to that, what I want to spend the first portion of our time here today is trying to ask the question, why is this happening? Young adults don't seem to be taking steps towards long-term commitment. And I want to probe into that question, that issue. What is it that's keeping young adults from taking those steps and making some commitments? Like I said before, we want to translate some of this passion, translate some of this desire into steps towards long-term commitments. So the roadmap for our time here together today, going to spend a few minutes walking through this very question right here. What are some of the things that are keeping them from taking those steps and making commitments? Why are they not moving towards long-term commitment? And then we'll spend the final portion of our time with me suggesting just a few things that we have found to be successful in our work with today's young adults. All right, so back to this question. What is keeping these young adults from taking steps and making commitments? What's happening? Why are they getting stuck in these cycles of short-term trips but not committing long-term? Why are they so seemingly passionate for the nations but not willing to consider the possibility of a career as a long-term worker? The truth is, there are so many things working against our young adults today, so many things that get in the way of them moving towards these long-term callings. My hope here in this next session is I want to try and simplify it as much as I can. Now, I recognize this is a complex topic, and there are so many things that keep young adults from stepping into long-term commitments, but I want to try and boil it down to what I would argue are kind of three of the main things that keep young adults from taking steps towards long-term. Number one, I would argue, is the lack of a clear and compelling vision. I believe one of the biggest problems our young adults face today is this: the lack of a clear and compelling vision. The lack of a clear and compelling vision that would lead them to saying, yes, this is worth investing my life in. Because I believe this is common. Like I've already said, there does seem to be a lot of passion out there. But when it comes to missions, there seems to be a lack of vision around what missions is and why they should consider giving their life to that kind of work. The why, the what, and even the how, I believe, presents a lot of confusion to a young adult. And so I want you to picture for a second a young adult stepping up to a pathway. And down that pathway, at the end of the pathway is a life in missions. And one of the first problems, I think, when we talk about this lack of clear and compelling vision is simply the fact that when they look down that pathway, there's just a lot of confusion. For a lot of young adults, the concept of missions is really confusing. At some point along the way, somewhere in the last, 10, 15, maybe even 20, 25 years, missions almost became equated with this idea of living missionally. Right, suddenly this idea of missions kind of became where missions was just everything. You know, local outreach, foreign outreach, evangelism, same culture, different culture. So many churches today are using missions to kind of describe anything and everything that they do. And I think this is dangerous because it can actually cause a lot of confusion. We've seen this a good bit with some of the students who are coming through our program. We ask every student who's going to go through our 3-month program, we ask them the question, what is missions? And overwhelmingly, the answers that we get to that question are something along the lines of, live for the glory of God wherever you are. Be all in for Jesus as you live your life. Live daily life as if you've been sent. You know, and all of these answers are good things. So don't hear me say living missionally is a bad thing. That certainly is not what I'm saying. But it lacks the clarity around the specific task of laboring to reach people of a different culture with the gospel. And that's what I would argue is really central to missions. Perspectives would define it this way. They would say missions is laboring to reach people of a different culture with the gospel, with the goal of establishing a viable indigenous church planting movement. Funny enough, I was actually just talking to Matthew right before this webinar, and he and Denny Spitters have just written a book called When Everything is Missions. and I believe what they are getting at with this book is really a central issue to what is keeping young adults from taking steps forward. So I'd encourage you to go find it. And wheneverythingismissions.com is where you can find some information about it. But without a clear and compelling vision, specifically for laboring to reach the places that have no access to the gospel, these young adults are left asking themselves the question, why should I even consider a long-term commitment to missions? You know, why should I go to unreached people groups? Why should I go to these places where the gospel is not, when there's so much opportunity here? And this is one of the most common questions we hear from young adults. So much need here, so many people here who need the gospel. Why would I consider doing this? And when they don't have that clarity around what missions is and the task that Christ gave his church to make sure there are disciples in every nation, it's real easy to land in this place. And so the young adult shows up to this pathway, they're looking out at a life towards missions, and all they can feel is confusion around what this missions thing is. Our founder, he has this quote, he says a lot, he says, a confused mind says no. They show up, they see the pathway, there's confusion, they're not sure what to do with it, and so instead of taking those steps to explore it and push through some of the challenges, a confused mind says no. I think this is something we're seeing happen a lot with our young adults who might be interested in a long-term calling. The confusion leads them to say no. All right, number 2. I think another big issue, one of the things that keeps young adults from taking steps towards long-term commitment is the inertia of life in America. And so if you got someone who would say, yes, I'm thinking about missions, I'm passionate for missions, and maybe at this point now they've got some clarity around what missions is. But something that we see happen all the time is that the natural inertia of life in America slowly pulls them away from a calling into missions. And so it's not that they ever stop and say, no, this is not what I want to do with my life. Simply, they don't have an easy, practical next step to go and explore that calling. You know, the step from I'm interested in missions to long-term commitment is too big of a step. It's too large of a step. And so instead of moving down that pathway that I described, instead of moving down the pathway of life and missions, they might have their eyes on it. They might be looking towards it, but slowly, oftentimes without them even realizing it, their feet are moving them in a different direction. Soon, everything it seems in that young adult's life is pulling him or her away from missions and towards life in America. Now think about this for a second. Think about all of the influences in a young adult's life and how many of them will be pulling them away from missions versus how many are pushing them towards missions. Their parents, their schooling, their friends, usually even their churches. I mean, this is the world we live in. Everything around them is screaming at them, get a good, sustainable job that will provide for your needs. A lot of millennials might need to hear that, but that's another day, another time. Get married, start a family, buy a house, and before you know it, these young adults who maybe were considering missions are anchored down here in America, and the chances of them actually moving overseas are now slim to none. And it's not that that young adult decided, no, I don't want to do missions. They just slowly over time moved in a different direction and never took a step towards exploring missions. And this inertia, it's slow and it's subtle, but it strongly pulls them away from that long-term desire to be overseas. Oftentimes very healthy desires, things you could even say are from God, are the very things that anchor them more into life in America. They'd never take the opportunity to explore what it could look like. And before they realize it, they're moving in a completely different direction. All right, number 3, if you've got someone who maybe has clarity around vision now, they understand what missions is, they're moving down that path, they are taking steps to explore a long-term calling and aren't letting the inertia of life in America pull them in a different direction. The third thing I would say gets in the way are the very many obstacles that will pop up on that journey towards life overseas. The journey towards a long-term calling overseas is filled with landmines, filled with obstacles along the way that could pop up and point them in a different direction. They might even be headed in the right direction to start with, but there are so many things that can pop up that would point them in a different direction. Parents, I know this is going to surprise most of you listening to this webinar today, but most parents don't want their kids moving to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Afghanistan to share the gospel. And so all it takes is a student who's passionate and excited about this and moving down that direction to have a really hard, challenging conversation with their parents, and they're moving in a different direction. Support raising is a big one. Asking people for money is not the American way, and it's been ingrained in our young people. Be independent, provide for yourself, don't rely on others. While I would argue that's not the biblical model, it certainly is the American way to not ask for money. And so the thought of support raising is a big obstacle. I could go on and on and on. Loneliness on the field, relationships, job opportunities that come along. So many things that could keep people from moving down that pathway and ultimately ending up overseas. It's not that they're not passionate enough. It's not that they're immature and irresponsible and afraid of commitment. It's just that they have so many obstacles to overcome to actually get to a long-term commitment on the field. And so the bottom line is, as I'm walking through this and thinking about this pathway for young adults as they're considering a life of long-term missions, here's what I want to hear. I want you to hear from me today, is that even for the most passionate of young adults who are hungering to make their lives count for the things that matter most, even for the ones who truly, genuinely desire to move overseas and plant churches amongst unreached people groups, most of them simply will not get there because the path is too difficult. It's not just because they're millennials. It's not because they're Gen Z. It's not because they have an overwhelming fear of commitment. The path is just too difficult if they don't have a guide. They need a guide. They need someone to show them the way. And that's what I would like to propose to you today, is the most important thing that we can do today to mobilize the emerging generation of missionaries. They need a guide. They need someone who's a little bit farther along to coach them, to mentor them, and guide them along that pathway towards missions. And what they really need is for that guide to be their local church. We are big believers in the local church, believing that God put the local church in place to reach the world, to reach the nations. And these young adults are looking for their churches to give them some guidance and give them some direction. And so this might be disappointing for some of you if you were hoping I was about to give you like a 3-step plan or a one-stop shop to solve all of your mobilization woes. That's not what I have today. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There's not a microwavable solution to pump out missionaries. But what I can tell you is that young adults today are hungering for some coaching, some mentoring. They're hungering for someone a little bit farther down the road to guide them towards this life of missions, and we believe that can be you. And so what I've got for you today are just a few principles I want to walk through to keep in mind as you think through this idea of guiding young adults towards a long-term calling into the mission field. I do want to address one quick question first. I've heard a lot of churches I've spoken with, a lot of church leaders I've spoken with, kind of ask this question. What does it look like for us to guide them? If someone's called, won't God make sure they end up overseas? God's the one calling. We're not the ones who provide the calling. We don't want to be the Holy Spirit or take over the Holy Spirit's role. Surely God's going to take care of this. Well, yes, we're on the same page. God is sovereign, and He is the one who is going to complete this mission. But I think if you're asking this question, I really believe you're asking the wrong question. And here's what I would propose is a better question to ask when you're thinking about mobilizing some young adults. How can my church coach, mentor, and guide young adults towards a life devoted to working amongst unreached people groups? Absolutely, we don't want to take the place of the Holy Spirit. He's the one who calls. But we would say we want to follow the biblical model that we see in the book of Acts and elsewhere of church leaders affirming callings, speaking out callings, and playing a significant role in helping the people of their church figure out how to use their skills, talents, and strengths for the glory of God and His mission in the world. So when it comes to missions and mobilization, how can my church coach, mentor, and guide young adults towards a life devoted towards working amongst unreached people groups? The first thing I'd like to advocate that they need in response to what I said is the first issue for that young adult who shows up to the pathway and all they see is confusion. Oh, got an extra slide. Sorry about that. What do they need for us to provide for them? We need to provide vision, clear and compelling vision. They need that from us, and I would argue that there are a few things more important that you could do right now for your people than keeping the vision of God's glory among the nations in front of them. It has to become a part of the culture. It has to become a part of the DNA of the church. Talk about it. Educate on it. Talk about it some more. They need to hear it from the pulpit. They need to hear it in the kids ministry, in the student ministry. Make it a part of the culture for your young adults to be hearing about God's heart for the nations. Your people, and especially your young adults, they need a clear vision specifically for missions. For the person that's passionate for the nations, but they don't know where to go and it feels very confusing for them, they need some clarity around what missions really is and why it matters. And like I said earlier, young adults, they are passionate and zealous, but they're also really smart. And if they don't have a clear and compelling reason to engage in something, they'll move in a different direction. And so just a few things here. What do they need clarity around? They need clarity around the biblical basis of missions. They need to understand what the Bible actually says about missions. And I'm not just saying a few missions references here or there, a few verses. They need to hear that the entire Bible is the biblical basis for missions. From Genesis to Revelation is the story of God's mission in the world, His mission to redeem all the peoples of the earth. They need to hear it's one coherent story from start to finish about a missionary God redeeming His people. They need to hear that God's heart is for all peoples, all nations, and that comes screaming out from Genesis to Revelation. There isn't just one verse or one passage. It's the whole Bible. It's clarity around what the Great Commission is actually saying. I'd imagine many of you are in a similar place as me when years ago, if you asked me what the Great Commission was communicating, I would have said something along the lines of, it's a generic call to go. Or maybe I would have said it's a discipleship verse. We need to be in our going. We need to be more active about sharing the gospel. But What our young adults today need to hear and understand is that the Great Commission isn't just a generic task. The Great Commission is a very specific task that Christ gave his church with a start and a finish. It's a specific task that all of his church has a part in playing. All of his church has a role. Not necessarily that every single person would end up being saved, but that there would be a gospel witness amongst all the peoples of the earth. That's what Christ was saying, to make disciples of all nations, that there be a gospel witness for all the peoples of the earth. And then right along with that, what the current state of the world is. You know, if in the Great Commission Christ said, go and make disciples of every ethne, of every people group, man, it's so important to know where the gospel is and where it's not. My personal story is that this information here, where the gospel is and where it's not, played a hugely significant role in my trajectory towards a life involved in missions. When I started to realize we now know today where the gospel is and where it's not, we now know who has the gospel and who doesn't. We know where they're located. We know how to get there. There's so much information out there today. It's really important that our young adults have clarity around this task. And finally, the last thing I'd say, I think it's important that people know the difference in being unreached with the gospel versus simply being lost. You know, lost is a spiritual state, as someone who doesn't know Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. But unreached is very different. Unreached deals with places around the world that have no access to the gospel. The amount of confusion out there around what unreached is and what unreached is not is one of the biggest sources of confusion for our young adults today. All right, number two, for the person who has clarity around vision, but they're getting caught up in inertia, the inertia of life in America, what do they need? We need to provide steps for them. Easy, practical steps. Like I said earlier, very rarely does a young adult go from I'm interested and passionate for missions to a long-term commitment. It's too big of a step. It's too big of a gap. They need some shorter, simpler, easier steps along the way. And so my encouragement for you and your church is to take the time to identify what those steps are and develop a roadmap for the people in your church. Now, I know that every church is different. Every church has a different culture, different DNA, different relationships, and different partnerships. And so I believe that roadmap that you might develop, the different steps along the way, is going to look different at every church. But what's important is that there's something there. At the church where the young adult is attending and as they're looking for guidance, that there's someone there that's able to say, hey, here are the steps. Here's what's next. Here's how you get there. Now, I would argue that while the actual roadmap is going to look different at every church, there are some categories of steps along the way that most people will move through on their journey towards long-term commitment to the nations. Stuff like awareness. Right? And for most people, it's going to start with some element of awareness, learning what missions is and why it matters, is that vision thing we were talking about. Next is exploration. They have some vision, they have some understanding. Most people, before they commit to something long-term, they're going to look for a way to go and explore missions, try it out, see if this is for them or not. After that, when they come back and they're back into their church, they're going to need a season of preparation. You know, every agency out there is going to ask them, hey, when was the last time you shared your faith with somebody? Tell me about your spiritual disciplines. Tell me about your prayer life. So many things like this that they'll need a season of preparing to move into this long-term calling. After that season, typically they're going to want to take the next step in getting specifically trained to go and do missions work. And so what would your church recommend for that training? Is it just connect with the agency, or are there specific training programs you want to suggest? But they're going to want to get trained before they go overseas. And finally, the going part. One of the biggest obstacles, and this is almost ironic, one of the biggest obstacles are the sending agencies themselves, simply because of how many there are. The overchoice problem for a lot of young adults is paralyzing because they don't know how to choose one. Which one's the best? Which one should they go with? They need someone at their church to guide them and say, hey, here are the agencies that we work with. Here are the agencies that we trust. I'd suggest that you connect with them and start taking steps forward. So just a real quick, this is just a kind of general, vague roadmap that I would put together for you to just see an example of what this could look like. Use your short-term trips as an entry point. I believe that if short-term trips are handled well, they're really valuable when it comes to missions. They're a great first step, great exposure, while also getting to connect with missionaries on the field and serve them in the work that they're doing. So raise awareness through that, and then come home and get a little bit more educated on missions. Offer a 6 or 8 or 10-week missions course at your church. Maybe connect them with perspective so they can deepen their understanding of what missions is. And then give them a chance to explore it. This is what we do at Catholics in 40, but there are plenty of other opportunities out there to go out there, to get overseas, to see what life would look like on the field in a long-term capacity. Once they've explored it and have a little bit more clarity, plug them into some sort of missions-focused community groups where they're doing some preparation, learning about missions work in general, how to take steps forward, how to share their faith, how to develop spiritual disciplines. And then finally, establish a sending agency at your church that you would say you would recommend and connect. Like I said, it's going to look different at every church, but the important thing is having some sort of roadmap, some steps that you can put in front of the young adults. And finally, what I would argue is central to young adults taking steps forward into missions is that they have some element of missions-minded community. This is huge for our young adults today. For that person who's on the track towards missions but has so many obstacles in their way, having a community of like-minded people who can encourage them, can walk with them, can challenge them, provide accountability in the midst of this journey is crucial. Especially young adults today, they are craving for relationship. If they got other people who are thinking the same things, saying the same things, and pursuing the same things, it's so much more likely that they'll stay on that track. And so I'd suggest in your churches finding ways to develop some sort of missions-focused community groups. Might be that you have some monthly gatherings for missions-minded people. I even know some churches who have developed some mentorship programs. Whatever it looks like, find ways to gather together some of the missions-minded people so that they can encourage one another, they can hold one another accountable, and move together down this journey towards long-term commitment to missions. All right, as I wrap up, I just want to say a few final thoughts. Again, thanks for joining us today. I truly believe that this next generation is strategically positioned to play a significant role in the completion of the Great Commission. This emerging generation of missionaries has the potential to move past the American dream and give themselves the task of seeing disciples of Jesus among every people group. But they need help. They need a guide, and your church is the guide they need. I think this is crucial if we want to see this next wave of missionaries reach the places where the gospel is not. That's all I got for today. Matthew, I'm going to pass it back to you now.
Stephen, thank you, brother. Very encouraging. And I think these principles actually apply not just to young adults, but to believers of every age. So again, thank you so much. I just want to make a comment before we turn it over to our audience here. I think it's easy to play the blame game and look at the problems in the millennial generation and point fingers. And in some ways, though, as I'm hearing what you're saying, I feel like it's a bit of an indictment against previous generations. I've heard someone say, where are the young radicals? And I think a better question is, where's the radical vision? Has the church given them a vision that is worthy of their lives and worthy of their sacrifice? When so much of our churches are focused on, I'm going to say health and wealth. And I don't mean the typical health and wealth gospel that I think so many of us abhor. But I mean this gospel that we bought into that said that Jesus died to build us havens of safety and comfort. And that's a turnoff to not only young adults, but I think to people who really want something substantial. So anyway, thank you so much for what you've shared. I want to turn this over to our viewing audience. This is your opportunity to address Stephen directly. Well, I'm getting a bunch of comments here, Stephen, not a lot of questions yet. So folks, keep in mind, if you have any questions, please address your questions. So the inertia factor really resonates. This is from Clifford. Al White gives a comment, great strategies. This is what I said, not only for young adults, but for older adults as well. Thank you so much, Stephen. Excellent presentation, exclamation point. You hit the hot spots with clarity. Thank you. This is from Connie. Again, I've got more comments here, but this is your time to ask Stephen directly any questions that might have surfaced during the presentation that you would like to talk to him about. So I'm going to give a second here for those to populate. Here we go. Rachel asks, any suggestions for content to use in a missions-focused community group? That's from Rachel.
Yeah, there's a few different ones out there. A lot of different options. Depending on where the people are. This is where some of the resources get challenging because it really depends on how far along they are and what they've experienced already. And so there is actually a brand new one I just explored this past week. It's called Journey to the Nations. It's from a guy named Mark Sigmund who did some work with perspectives. I found that to be really quality. I haven't done a deep dive into it yet. There's a study out there called the Explorer Study. I believe it was put out by the Center for Missions Mobilization. It's not EX, it's XPLORE, Explorer. If you're looking at getting involved in mobilization, there's one called Go Mobilize. We also recommend, if you're looking for more of a devotional, there's one called God's Heart for the Nations by Jeff Lewis out in California. So just a few there that I think are valuable and helpful, although I will say there are tons of options out there for those kinds of studies.
So I want to insert one there too. There is a small devotional, 31 days, a little blue book. It's called Gospel Meditations for Missions. It's put out by a group called Churchworks, and it is incredible. It is biblically based, motivational, very practical, and it would be easy for a small group to go through that in a number of weeks. I highly recommend it here. Okay, so let's see here. Wow, now I've got hundreds of questions. We find the best ones here. I am David from Nigeria. Hey, David, I'm so glad you're online today. He says, how do you engage changing the narrative of everything is missions in a church when you're not the senior pastor or teaching pastor? Any guide or help?
Whew, you better pray hard. That's my first answer is to pray hard. It is. I will say this, it's not impossible. It's very challenging if the senior pastor doesn't embody that hunger and passion for missions. Doesn't mean things can't happen, but you don't want to go around the pastor. And that's what I don't think I can stress that enough. The worst thing you could do is almost create division within the church of you're leading people in one direction and the senior pastor is leading in a different direction. I'd encourage you to challenge the pastor and offer some thoughts as to why you would argue that there needs to be more of a focus to missions. I would continue having those conversations. In the midst of that, making sure you're honoring your leader. Gosh, I want to make sure I stress that a lot. Honor him in the midst of his leadership or her in the midst of the leadership of the church. Pray really hard. Keep asking questions. Keep bringing it up. I go to a church here in Georgia where the missions pastor was a guy who he just kind of kept coming to the senior pastor and saying, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about this. And just over time, the senior pastor grew to really trust him. And gave him a lot of freedom. And he started out really young, maybe even a zealous, fiery, naive young adult. But over time, he earned the trust of his pastor. And then when he actually left to go to the mission field, after he left, the pastor was saying he wanted somebody else like that. He said, I want somebody who's going to kind of keep harassing me, keep bringing this up, keep bringing these questions to my mind to make sure that we don't forget. Because it's really easy for senior pastors to almost I'm not going to say forget, but they've got so many things on their plate that they can forget to put a primary emphasis on what missions is. And so keep supporting them, keep encouraging them, but also keep mentioning why you're so passionate for missions.
Yeah, I want to emphasize something you said. It's a process. It's not instantaneous.
That's right. That's right.
Leadership that doesn't have a biblical mooring when it comes to missions. It's not going to happen overnight. In fact, for many of you online, it was probably a discovery process for yourself. So we have to remember we didn't know this immediately either. I hate to seem self-serving here, but there's a book you can buy called When Everything is Missions. And the book that Stephen mentioned, we just recently wrote. And the book is exploratory. We don't come in with guns loaded saying, here's the definition of missions and you're all wrong. We ask 7 key questions in the book. So it is an exploratory process where hopefully people end up returning to the Word and allowing the Word of God to shape their definition of mission. So again, I want to recommend that book. I think it's great for small groups or even leadership teams to go through. And in fact, the final chapter is a discussion guide of the 7 questions. So wheneverythingismissions.com. This is an interesting question, Stephen. Have you begun noticing any key differences between millennials and Gen Z?
That is a great question. We haven't yet. I need to go back and see where the cutoff is. For Cafe 1040, the minimum age we allow is 18 years old. Matthew, if you know that right off the top of your head, I can't remember exactly where the cutoff is.
I don't remember it either, no.
Yeah, so we haven't dealt much with Gen Z yet, but we're preparing for them. I think we're still a couple years out before Cafe 1040 we have Gen Z coming in.
Yep.
And so we haven't done much with that yet, but we're already starting to read the studies and starting to get educated on what's coming next. Check back with me in a few years and I'll show you what we found.
Yeah, I've got a question here from Dawn, maybe just circling back to what we just said. I think it's going to be a common theme here with your emphasis on compelling biblical missions vision. What's the best thing to do if your church is so missional, in quotes, they don't see the urgency of reaching the actual unreached? Many conversations have happened to attempt to communicate this. I might just say, Don, what the previous comments, and I'll recommend the book. Let's move on. That's important, Don. I'm not overlooking it, but I think we've already addressed it. How can missions, this is good. This is from Heather. How can missions organizations and agencies partner with local churches to provide that missions-minded community to foster missions vision?
How can they provide the missions-minded community? Is that what you said, Matthew?
How can agencies partner with churches to provide missions-minded community? How do they foster that?
Yeah, I got a few thoughts here. One of the main things that I think we're seeing this actually across the missions industry is just recognizing the role that the church is to play in the mobilization. I think historically in years past, that piece of it might have been overlooked. And so having that heart, that mindset to come in and say, we're as the missions agencies, as missions people, we want to serve the church, coming in with that mindset, then it's so much about each individual church and where they are and what they need. And so I think my answer, and this might be cheating the question, so sorry about that, but I think my answer is just come in with a servant's heart to see how the expertise and the experience that the missions agency has can serve those individual churches. I think if you try and come up with a kind of catch-all, this is what we do to provide missions community, I think you'll find that most churches aren't looking for something like that. But if you can come in just saying, hey, we want to serve you. We live the missions world. This is what we do day in and day out. We'd love to help in any way that we can for your church to establish some missions-focused community. How can we help? I think that's how I would recommend you approach that topic.
Yeah, that's a good word. I think agencies really need to come in with a listening heart.
Yeah, that's good.
What is your vision as a church? Does your church have a vision for the world? And if so, how might we serve you in that? That's a good word there. This is from Cindy. This is such great confirmation of our new mission, our new ministry called Mentoring to Missions. We are connecting younger people to older, more experienced servants. Great job, Cindy. She asks, do you find churches or colleges to be the best source?
Do I find churches or colleges to be the best source?
Yes.
For the mentors?
I'm guessing that's what she's asking here, yeah.
Yeah, so it's so funny this question came up. I was just meeting with a gentleman yesterday who works here in a church where I'm located, and they're developing a mission mentorship program, and he was sharing the same thing. They're having a hard time finding mentors who have a heart for this kind of work, but also the knowledge and the expertise to be able to speak into the roadmap and offer suggestions. And so I think my primary suggestion would be that they are actively involved in your church would be the main place where mentors need to come from. And depending on the size of your church, I don't know how many options you'll have for that. But gosh, there's so many people out there that want to give some guidance and give some expertise, and even what Matthew and the guys at 1615 do with helping provide some coaching. There are lots of other people out there that do that kind of work. So if it's a matter of learning the skills and learning how to mentor and how to coach, I would say find people in your church and then teach them and train them how to do that rather than trying to go outside the church.
Yeah. So this is from Daniel. What's the roadmap to mobilizing a church where missions is a slice of the church life's pie chart towards missions becoming more the center part of everything they do? How do you move missions from the margins to the core, my friend? That's the question.
Yeah, I think we're sensing some common themes here, Matthew, aren't we?
Yeah, we sure are.
Yeah. It's, I've thought so much about this. I mean, I live a mobilization world, and this is the kind of question that keeps me up at night, just to be honest with you. And I will reiterate what Matthew said before. It's a process. It is slow. Awareness and education are such a big part of this. I heard a quote. I don't know who gave the quote initially, but they said, awareness will never solve the problem, but the problem will never be solved without awareness. Mm-hmm. And so until there's some element of understanding, and the education piece is coming in around what missions is and how it's not just a slice of the pie, but it's what the church is actually designed to do, is to accomplish God's mission in the world. And oftentimes, until senior leadership really embodies that vision, it's hard for it to become part of the culture, part of the DNA of the church. Now, that is what I would argue is what we want to go towards. Is not just, hey, here's a trip for the missions people. Gosh, that was, if you're listening to this, you might be one of those people. And I can just tell you, I've been there where, you're off the side and you're viewed as the missions guy, and you're wanting to scream saying, I'm not the missions guy, Jesus is the missions guy. And, we're all the missions people. But that's what we're going for, is trying to get to the place where it's just a part of the culture. It starts with senior leadership and trickles down to the rest of the organization. And so the more you can talk about it, the more you can educate on it, the more you can bring up these important conversations around stuff like, why should I leave here when there's so many lost people here? What are unreached people groups? What does the Bible say about mission? Mm-hmm. Until those things are really clearly understood by the majority of people in the church, it's hard to get it to be a part of the culture. But I do think it's possible. It just takes time.
Yeah, something we often say, and this surfaces in our book that has been previously mentioned, knowing comes before doing and shapes doing. And there's a lot of poor missions practices because there's a lot of poor missions thinking. And so I want to reinforce what you just said. Don't skip the education piece. Here's the point. Programs do not mobilize churches. Conferences do not mobilize churches. Books don't mobilize churches, as though I just wrote one. People working through a process, that's what mobilizes churches.
Yeah, that's great, Matt. And that's, as I was talking today, that's really what we have discovered. You can't just have a 1, 2, 3, 4 step process and suddenly it's going to happen. It's principles, and it's working with people, finding where they are, meeting them where they are, and helping them take steps forward.
Yeah, that's right here. Okay, so here's another one. How do you feel about pairing young adults up with missionaries in the field, not with a particular mission, but with the missionary as a person?
For a mobilization perspective, is I assume what they're asking. Yeah, I love
for the mentoring perspective, probably, right?
Yeah. For the mentoring perspective, if that's where they're coming from, I love the idea of that. And my experience has been that it is very challenging for those on the field to be able to carve out enough time to do that well while they're actually on the field. So if they come home, certainly that would be a great option. or if they're the kind of person who is able to carve out the time to mentor. I love that idea. If you can make that happen, man, what a powerful mobilization tool that is for the young adult who's wanting to kind of grow in their missions understanding. Even if it wasn't, I'm pursuing this for a mentoring relationship, here's something I would encourage actually. It's for the young adult to view it as, hey, I want to bless and serve this missionary. And so took the time to pray for them regularly, to send them emails letting them know how they're praying for them. Check in and say, how are you doing? How's life overseas? To celebrate them when the good things are happening and cry with them when the hard things are happening. If they can view it more as I want to serve and resource you, I think the mentoring would happen naturally. And that really increases the investment and engagement of young adults in missions when there is that real person on the field they can be working with.
Yeah, that's a good word. Wow, this has been a rich time. There's so many questions, Stephen. I'm not going to be able to get to them. So, folks, if we did not address your question live today, I apologize. We just ran out of time here. I want to take a moment because so many of the questions really relate to what 1615 does, and Stephen mentioned that. We have a process that we take local churches through that helps them really discover a biblical global vision that's unique to their church, but it fulfills the mandate to reach all nations. We help them design a strategy and we help them deploy it. And a big part of what we do is we help senior and key leaders get on board. How do we make them a part of that journey and process so they own the vision? And then how do we mobilize the whole church, not just the missions-minded few, which obviously includes an emphasis on the young adults as well. So if you're interested in learning how 1615 can really help your church clarify its biblical global vision, put a strategy together, and deploy it, please visit our website at 1615.org. Stephen, as you were sharing, I thought of this great quote by A.B. Simpson, who was an incredible missions prophet in our day. And again, I started talking about, when you were finished, the part of the indictment or the criticism belongs to us, the previous generations. We have a responsibility to cast a God-sized, heart-grabbing vision that will capture these young adults. The reason they're wandering is because they're not getting that vision in the churches. Not all of them, but they're not getting it there. And I thought of what A.B. Simpson said about young people. He's in heaven now, of course, but he says, God is preparing his heroes. And when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment. And the world will wonder where they came from. And so those heroes are there in our churches. They're young people, but they need a compelling vision. They need a guide. And when the time comes, he's going to put them in his perfect place for them in his kingdom work. So, Stephen, again, thank you so much for sharing today. Just a few things for those of you who are still online here. I'm going to leave that up for just a moment. If you want more information on Cafe 1040, you can write that down. And finally, just the two upcoming events that we spoke of, a two-part series on finances and their role in missions, rethinking what it means to be generous, and then how charitable investing can do great things for the kingdom of God. I want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded. It will be available within the week for viewing. Stephen, thank you so much for your time today. I thank the audience as well for the great questions. I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615. Thank you all for listening.